Hey, deserving listeners, today we have a special guest on the podcast. She emailed me and said that she wanted to talk about her experiences as a sex cult survivor. So welcome to the podcast, Christina.
Thanks, Kirk. I'm super excited to be here.
So can you introduce yourself so people know who you are and where you're coming from, that sort of thing?
My name is Christina Babin. I'm here to talk about it and hopefully to create less secrecy and stigma in the area of surviving cults and high control groups. And I think it's something that is not as far in the past as people think. And it's the current thing that still occurs and will keep occurring unless we really educate ourselves.
Yeah, it's interesting how I think I would have thought with the internet and with all the documentaries about cults, there would be a lower prevalence, but it doesn't seem to be slowing down.
Yes, I do have a little bit of hope because it does seem like the groups that have been forming, like NXIVM and Teal Swan, they don't seem to be able to get as far as they would in the past. So I just want to put a little hope out there. I just finished watching the documentary about Teal Swan. And one of the things I was thinking the whole time was like, wow, she definitely seems like a cult leader. And if this was way back in the 1960s and people didn't know that cults even existed, it probably would have gotten crazy out of hand. And still may, but I think their power is not as strong with as many people, but you always have that core group. And like you've said many times on your podcast, a cult can be, a high control relationship. It's the same thing as a cult, really. You can have that with just two people.
Right.
And there's a lot of similarities in cult-like behaviors and thought reform that happen in small groups or large groups. It's just something we have to be aware of. But yeah, it's amazing that it still does happen. But I think to me that says a lot about the needs that us humans have that maybe get overlooked, and also the importance of what you're doing and people like you are doing in shining a light on trauma, shining a light on emotional intelligence, and just the human experience and what we need and how to meet those needs. And if you look at all the cult leaders, that's what they're doing. They're meeting this need for purpose and community. And they're targeting people that are, kind of in flux. I call it a liminal space, where they're not, they're kind of in between two things. They haven't started their next passion or their next thing, and they're feeling kind of lost. But so I was raised in the Children of God. They turned into the Family International, but they were one of the largest cults in existence to this day.
Where was it?
It was all over the world. It started in Huntington Beach in the 1960s, led by David Berg. And it started out as kind of a puritanical, very grassroots kind of, I call it Christian adjacent group, where there was a lot of Christian influence, but all interpreted in his own way. But just enough so that the youth of that day, my parents, were easily sold on to it because there was some familiarity with the Christian religion.
So did you say this is the 70s?
Yeah, late 60s, early 70s, yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting because the church that I grew up in was founded in the late 60s, early 70s, and it had a similar thing. I think a lot of Christian churches started to emerge in the 60s and 70s, because the way I describe it is sort of like suburban hippie.
Yes.
The way that I would say it, it's like not full on hippie, but like baby boomers that aren't super enthusiastic about stuffy Catholic churches. And they're looking for a more family oriented, down to earth, positive, love conquers all, maybe even socially conscious church that has younger people. There's less hocus pocus, there's less ritual and more, communion and gathering and hugging and and emotional talk, particularly on the West Coast, right? Because I in Seattle and Huntington Beach, for those who don't know, is near Los Angeles or in Los Angeles, right?
Yeah.
And so the movement on the West Coast at the time was, and I think people forget this, how hippie culture and Christianity was very much, there's a huge Venn diagram. Because today we think of like rock and roll and hippies and drug culture and counterculture to be completely separate from Christianity. Christianity is very conservative in our current understanding. But in the early 70s, it was kind of cool to believe in Jesus, that Jesus was love and Jesus was a pacifist and Jesus was anti-capitalism and Jesus spoke out against the man. And Jesus had long hair and wore flowy clothes and said, peace will conquer all. I mean, he was right down the middle, hippie. And so all these people that grew up in more conservative, traditional churches started to create these other kinds of churches. My church did not turn into a cult, but it sounds like yours did.
Yes.
So you were a kid of the 70s?
Yeah. I'm 48 now.
Okay.
So I was one of the first kids in the group. Yeah, I think if you look at religion in those times, it was very stuffy. And so any break off from that, even if you're still in the Christian category, at that time was extremely radical. And so it was a big draw because you still had that spirituality. A lot of these groups encourage in the beginning, what are you unhappy with? What did your parents do to you? What is society trying to force you to do? So there's this kind of, pseudo therapy going on in the beginning. And, so people kind of need that, but then it kind of ends there. And then let's recreate you. So yeah, I was, my mom joined as a young, dissatisfied person. I was already born, but I was a baby. And she joined a very beautiful group. She thought this was a thing to raise her kids in, that we were going to be safe from violence, from American capitalism. We were going to live a communist lifestyle that was peaceful and, all this wonderful stuff. And it just, once they kind of got big enough that the U.S. government started cracking down, and then they took the cult overseas.
Why did they crack down? What was the government seeing?
A lot of parents of the teenagers joining were complaining and going to the authorities and saying, they've taken my kid, they won't let them go, there's brainwashing going on.
What was happening, do you think, in terms of, they were doing typical high control things like your parents are against you?
Mm-hmm. And they would isolate them. During those times, you were never allowed to be alone. You were supposed to cut ties with your family completely, and you just kind of disappeared. So parents were calling the authorities, looking for their kids. These are all older teenagers, but there was probably, it was kind of not that crazy yet.
Yeah.
So it was the government was taking notice.
What year was this? Because Jim Jones was a famous case that predated this point, or?
No, actually, that was going on at the same time. We didn't know it at the time because we weren't allowed to watch the news or read the newspapers. But when Jim Jones exploded and they had the mass suicide, that's when David Berg made everybody leave the U.S. and did a fake disbanding of the group, and then reconnected overseas and started it up again with a different name. So the FBI was already looking for him. Interpol was already looking for him.
What was his name again?
David Berg. So
that was the charismatic leader. He's the Jim Jones. He's the David Koresh.
Yes.
And where did you reform?
All over the world. He went, I believe, to Europe first. And everybody was supposed to just pick a country and go to a country and start gathering disciples and make communes. And it sounds very disorganized, but it was actually hyper-organized. There was a structure of leadership that was extremely intense. There were leaders in a commune, then there were area leaders, then there were country leaders, there were inspections. You had to write daily reports about what was going on. So all of that was going on. And like I said, in the beginning, they were very puritanical. So there was no, it was not a sex cult. It was much more on the Pentecostal side. No holding hands, no kissing, no romantic relationships. Marriages were, basically arranged, if that, but they weren't even trying to allow that to happen. And then after they left the States, then David Berg started introducing his sexual doctrine, and it just kind of snowballed into insanity.
So where were you? So what year was this, and where were you, do you think?
So 1968 was when it kind of all started, 68, 69. By 1972 was when they called it like persecution, and he started becoming a little more risque in what he was talking about. He started a lot of anti-American rhetoric and started getting a lot more attention. By 1974, they had already started leaving the U.S., and that's when I was born. And that's when he introduced his first sexual doctrine, which was the law of love, and where he said that anything that was done in love is okay, and which is very interesting because Aleister Crowley had the exact same saying, everything that is done in love, that law is love. And it was very interesting. Turns out there was a lot of plagiarism going on, but our parents who were young hippies, maybe not all of them well read, whereas David Berg was a lot older than everybody, and he was well read.
Well, and where would you find this information? The other thing that should be pointed out is in Los Angeles, this is right on the heels of Charlie Manson, which yes. I'm guessing amps up the authorities' concern about these kinds of, and then of course, as a broader thing, there were a lot of communist and socialist anti-government movements, terrorists, domestic terrorists, bombings. People forget about this too. They think like today we have all this strife and domestic violence happening. In the 70s, it was commonplace. The way that today we think of mass shootings as commonplace. In the early 70s, there were American citizens young people who were in these little either mini cults or mini terrorist groups that were killing professors and politicians and all sorts of things like that. And so, the government was obviously interested in trying to identify these kinds of things before they get out of hand. Who is Aleister, you said?
Aleister Crowley, cult leader that predated most of the U.S. cults. He kind of started the whole occult movement in the U.S.
Okay.
He had a lot of writings. And
when was he? What time span was he?
I want to say it was the 1920s.
And he was in the States?
Yes, he was in the U.S. and then a little bit in Europe too. Okay. But it is so strange to me to read his writings and then read David Berg's writings, and there's so much of his theories and doctrines peppered into David Berg's writings. And there were just so many, like I grew up thinking that he plagiarized like children's fairy tales that I thought that he wrote. So like Alice in Wonderland was retold as a cautionary tale about us leaving the cult and about how dangerous the outside world was. He actually made Alice in Wonderland creepier than it actually already is. And Beauty and the Beast was another story that he, plagiarized and turned into this beautiful love story of why our mothers had to be prostitutes. And he took all this crazy doctrine and just like flipped normal things into what he wanted them to say. It was pretty crazy. Now looking back, it was normal growing up. Just that's all we knew. And one of the things you'll notice with true cults, like we kind of throw the word cult around very loosely these days. And I think it's kind of like when we talk about a narcissist, somebody can have narcissistic qualities, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are a narcissist. It's the same with cults. Different groups can have cult-like qualities, but to me, a cult really has to have these high control situations where you are isolated, where you are controlled, where your thoughts are not your own. You're not allowed to think, you're not allowed to move, and your environment is completely controlled. A great book was written by Robert Lifton, and it's called Mind Control or Thought Reform. And he lists out like 8 criteria of what a cult has to have. And the first one is milieu control, which means the control of your surroundings and your communications. So everything, all information is controlled, your living environment is controlled, and it's like the number one thing to shut somebody off from the world. And then it goes on from there. So I always look at like in the documentary that I just watched with Teal Swan, her inner group lives in the same house as her. So they don't have this separation where they get to go home and have these private conversations that are not overheard. She was isolating her people from having romantic relationships with other people, which was something that was done in our cult. It was mostly arranged marriages, and after a certain amount of time, they would break you up and marry you with somebody else, so that the loyalty was always to the leader and to the cult. You couldn't make like emotional bonds with other people.
Right. Yeah. David Koresh did this. Cult leaders often do this. And it always makes me wonder, did it just naturally occur to them? Or is there a playbook somewhere, like you said, from the earlier cult? It's always like, does it just sort of emerge? Because it always has the same playbook. Now, there are some cults where there aren't a sexual component, like the Comet people in Los Angeles. I can't remember. The people who had Nike shoes on.
Yes. So I'm glad that you brought that up. Okay, so one of the things that we see in all cults, and including that one, is the control of sexuality. So what it will happen is it's either no sex, or it's all sex, or sex with a certain person. But either way, the thing that they all seem to have in common is some kind of sexual exploitation, as well as denying you sex.
Interesting.
And I think one of the reasons for that is I think that it's so personal.
Yeah.
That if you control that part of somebody, then it's like it's one of the most intimate, enjoyable things. It's just, it's a great way to control somebody.
Yeah, that's what I thought too, because when you're having sex or even masturbating, it's a very personal experience. There's the cult leader isn't on your mind, and you're able to enjoy yourself or enjoy someone else. And
so we actually had a doctrine, and you were not allowed to think about your partner or your sex. You had to literally picture Jesus as the partner you were having sex with, whether you were male or female. And homosexuality or being gay was completely forbidden. Yet you still had to visualize having sex with Jesus. They had dirty talk that we were taught that we had to say out loud. So it wasn't just like you were supposed to be thinking it, but then you had to say it out loud to each other. So you're just making love to a shell of a person. That person is not there.
You know, within reason, what were some of these phrases? And were you taught this as a child?
I was a teenager when this came out.
Still, though, a minor.
But, the first wave of kids, we were all taught that we were supposed to have sex with whoever asked us to. And so there was a lot of that going on.
Regardless of gender or just the girls?
Not boys as well. No gay sex was allowed, but a lot of the young men had sex with the aunties. They were all aunties and uncles, and the uncles with us girls. And eventually they did stop doing that, but they told all the adults in a burn after reading that it was never a sin and it wasn't wrong, and they weren't going to punish anybody for doing it. But because of the world finding out about it, they had to stop. So what happened was they just continued to protect all the people who were engaged in that, and they stayed in the group. So officially stopped, but not, if you know what I mean.
So what were the phrases that they taught you to say to each other? Because in my head, I'm like, is it some sort of robotic thing like, yes, give it to me hard? Or is it somehow like, Jesus, please do this thing to me? Or
Yes,
really?
Like, me, Jesus. I want your seed, Jesus. Make babies in me, Jesus. Like, just crazy, really dorky, crazy stuff. It was a crazy, wild ride, and I'm happy to be out and free of it. But it's really interesting because there are so many similarities in pretty much every cult that I read about or study about. The Children of God was one of the largest groups that had a conspiracy with training the children, and this has not been studied, and it needs to be because you couldn't legally do this study, but the children were highly trained, and we did mock trials. We did mock police raids. So by the time the police did start raiding compounds, the children were all completely prepared to deal with the stress, to know how to answer the questions, and we knew what was coming. Wow. And in some of these mock things, we were pretending to get shot and killed because that was one of the possibilities. And so, the kids handled themselves very well in the raids. And, they kind of got away with it.
Wow, that's intense. So how many people do you think worldwide was a part of this cult So
overall, we believe around 100,000 were somehow involved.
Wow.
The most members we think that they had at a time was about 10,000, most of those being children. So birth control was not allowed. Everybody had to have kids, and as many as you could have. And that's how they closed off the group. So once they got their initial members, they stopped getting disciples from outside so that it could be closed off. And new disciples were gained by having children.
And these are initially a lot of American citizens, but then eventually started to incorporate locals from the surrounding area.
Yeah, we got like a wave of locals in all the different countries. But like I said, they really stopped doing as many disciples once everybody started having kids.
And what country were you in again?
I was in Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Mexico, Canada, the U.S., Guam, Hawaii, Saipan.
Wow. All in the span of just your childhood, all those places?
Yeah. I think I was a young adult when I got back to the States.
And was that because your parents were part of the leadership or something, or
No. So they moved everybody around constantly.
Oh.
Communes opened and closed. They moved you on purpose so that you wouldn't get connected to people, so that the authorities wouldn't catch on if you left. All of our communes had walls around them. So when you would leave the compound to go begging or to go out, you would duck in the van so that nobody could see how many people were coming and going. But once neighbors started getting friendly, then the commune would close and then we would move. Once we were around 11, they took all of us away from our parents. Parents would send their kids off to get training, and then they just trafficked us from commune to commune. And different communes could request teenagers to be sent to their home to work. So we were just chattel slaves, and we just worked, and they would, like chess pieces, move us around to help different communes if they needed more manpower.
So do you think it was purposeful to isolate people from each other? Do you think they knew
100%.
that that's what they were doing?
Well, what's interesting is that this is one of the most documented cults. So you can actually go to xfamily.org, and not all, because some of them were burned, but we got our hands on most of the publications that they printed out. And everything they said, we don't want you making loyalties with each other. You need to be able to be moved whenever we want you to move. So there was a lot of participation in the abuse and participation, because they would tell us, here, you need to not have these emotional bonds, because everybody is your family and we want you to be able to fit in wherever we need you to. So you kind of knew what was going on, but
by that point, they had already indoctrinated people through a slippery slope process.
Yes.
That they could say anything and even tell them, we're going to abuse you, you're in a cult now. And they'd be like, okay, well, I think some of the listeners might be thinking, well, this sounds like a horrific, traumatic experience for Christina. And I want to tell people that I've already emailed with you and knew that this is something you've talked a lot about before. If this was the first time you had ever talked about this, I wouldn't have you on the podcast. I would have you go to a therapist and to recover from those traumas. So I want to point that. I don't want to give the impression that somehow if you've been through something like that among the listenership that Christina represents someone that's talking about it for the first time. So can you talk about that process?
Yeah. So I'm really glad that you're mentioning that, because that kind of plays into some of the stigma and ideas that we have about survivors. So it took me probably 10 years after leaving the cult for me to even admit to myself that I had grown up abused. there was a good 10-year span where I, for the first time, read books, read outside books, watched outside movies, learned that you could pick a different flavor of ice cream, just basic stuff like that before I could even face the emotional and physical abuse. And then it took me another probably 15 years and, to feel comfortable enough to really start doing therapy, and kind of never really knew that was an option, and went into therapy. I took it really, really slow. It has taken me over 20 years to be able to talk about this. I think the average, like we have a lot of laws where, there's a statute of limitations, but the average sexual victim, it takes them about 15 years to be able to talk about it. And most of them are like in their 50s, so I do think our laws need to catch up with the statistics, but it takes a long time. It's not magic, and it's not once you get out of these groups, all of a sudden you're all better. I had to learn how to think for myself, because my thoughts were never my own. I was taught that my thoughts were dangerous and I couldn't think. So to come out and just learn how to be a human, a lot of times what they tell you when you go through something traumatic, you kind of have to relearn your childhood. You have to kind of, go back. When you get out of a domestic abuse relationship, you kind of have to go back to your healthier years as a child and kind of pull on those experiences. But with people who grow up in a cult or in some of these extreme situations, you are never a child. You were constantly prepared. Every night your bedtime stories were about dying and being a martyr. The songs were about dying, being a martyr. You never had a childhood. So you kind of have to learn how to be a kid and learn how to be a person and be an individual. And it's a journey. But a lot of people are extremely uncomfortable with these subjects. And the few times in the past that I had kind of hinted to people, I was shut down immediately. They would say, don't talk about that.
Why? I mean, like just random people at work or friends or something?
Friends and family. It really was the Me Too movement. When that happened and everybody just started saying Me Too, and I remember saying Me Too on Facebook. And I was like, I can actually speak out. And I talked to a couple friends and I was believed. And I was like, wow. And
prior to that, people wouldn't believe you?
It wasn't that they wouldn't believe, like they never even let me, if I said like, oh, I had a traumatic childhood, they would be like, you're fine. Like, you're fine. You don't think about that. You're fine. Don't talk about that. And so I would never get very far.
Yeah. So
it was a really slow unraveling of me coming out public. And I came out to my kids, and they, of course, they're in their 20s, and they were all like, wow, we're so proud of you. That's great. And they jokingly were like, we always knew you were weird. Now it makes sense.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, on one level, they're like, oh my goodness, our mom is this really strong survivor. On the other hand, it's like, it couldn't affect, those experiences had to have affected your personality and your parenting. And there's probably some quirks that you have as a parent that, might be innocuous or even positive, but they're just like, oh, so that's why you do that. That's different from other parents or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. The first chocolate chip cookies that I made was with my kids. I just lived vicariously through them. And to this day, I'm very childlike in my joy. And it's young people love me, but it is very different. But I also, passed on some of the trauma to my kids as well. There were a lot of things that now that they're older, that they're like, oh, Mom, this was not okay. One of them was I was not educated and never went to school, taught myself how to read when I was like around 11. I worked my whole life. There was no time for school. And David Berg didn't allow it. So when my kids were younger, I had to figure out how to, pay the bills and feed them. And so I started a family business and made my kids work. And, I always made sure they got paid and they got their money, and I didn't take their money from them, but then they could go buy clothes and buy shoes. And I thought that was great, because growing up a slave, you were punished severely if you kept any of the money for yourself. So I thought, oh, I'm doing something great. And
What age are we talking about right now?
For my kids?
Yeah.
I want to say by the time they were like 8,
Okay.
I started like...
So what kind of work?
Oh, we had, it's funny, the kids talk about it as really awesome, but then also not so awesome. We had an entertainment business, and we did puppet shows and large group entertainment with giant puppets and theater and just very awesome stuff. It was very cool.
Like birthdays and stuff?
Yeah, mostly festivals though. Like large festivals. Okay. And we traveled around the South just performing, and there were aspects of it they loved, but they learned a great work ethic, but they also felt the family's pressure to make money and survive, because the conversations that we had in front of them were very, like, oh, we better do good at this festival so we can buy some food. And they would hear that, and then they would feel pressure to work. And I didn't know any better. And so now they're all amazing people. They have great work ethics. They excel at everything that they do, but they also still fight with that perfectionism and having a lot of self-worth in their career and what they do, instead of just being okay with who they are. So, I feel a little emotional about this.
Yeah. To think about that your kids are suffering because of that.
Yeah. It's a generational trauma is a real thing. And they're all in therapy, which is wonderful. And it is part of life. I don't think anybody grows up perfect without issues or hurdles.
Yeah, no, Christina, I mean, what I always tell people is the best you can do as a parent is to raise your kids to only need 5 years of therapy instead of more.
Yeah.
The other thing I was thinking, because it's always true that for all of us, people, particularly people who grew up with difficulty and parents or systems that treated us poorly, we as adults, the best we can usually do is get rid of 80-90% of that. But there will always be a little bit of it, because our sense of what is okay or what should trigger feelings of discomfort as a parent is askew. So there were times when you probably thought, well, they should be working at the age of 4, but no, that's absurd. So you're working against your nature to say, I'm not going to put my 4-year-olds to work. You're working against your nature to allow your kids to have joy and to have freedom and autonomy. So you had to work again, it was probably uncomfortable for you to do that, because you had this indoctrination that you're constantly working against in terms of how things feel to you. And so you did so much of that to kind of counter the gut feeling you had. But it's always going to be a little off. You'll either undercompensate or overcompensate a little bit, because you were never shown a healthy range of those kinds of behaviors and those kinds of parenting decisions. So the fact that it sounds like you got rid of 95% of it, which is the most any parent could ever hope for.
Yes.
And your kids, whether they know it or not, I'm sure some of them might at this point, but they'll particularly know it later on, and maybe if they listen to this podcast, that they lucked out, because other people of your age that got out of the cult are probably much worse off in terms of their parenting. Not because there's something wrong with them, because, it's just that those people just didn't have the resources or the resilience that you do. Yeah,
well, my first 2 were actually born in the cult.
Wow.
So they always say, wow, we got lucky.
Yeah.
I know as a kid too, I did take a lot of pride in that. So there were only two ways of income, and one was our moms being prostitutes. And then the other one was us kids would beg on the streets. We would sing, or we would have cans and ask for money. And as a kid, to get to leave the commune was exciting because you'd get to see things. Sometimes people would pass you a piece of candy. You'd get to see televisions in the shops. So it was just a chance to get out. And I also felt pride in that I could do something, that I could make money, that I could bring home money. And so I think for me, I was like, here's something that I can do. So I never kind of looked at work as a bad thing. It was something that kept you safe. It was something that made people happy that you were working, and you were more valuable the more money you could bring in. So it's this weird, it's complicated, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's nothing wrong with a kid feeling pride in being able to succeed and get something done, but there is something harmful when a child feels like their primary worth, or one of their major, one of the major reasons why they have worth is in terms of hard cash. It's one thing if a kid is just like, I sold lemonade on the corner and I made $2, and the kid's like going, look at me. That's when a kid feels like they accomplished something, or they did a chore and they managed to, halfway clean the bathroom, but you want to reward them, so you give them a $5 bill, and they're just like, I did a chore, and you're like, no, you didn't, you barely cleaned it, but good job, kid. It's one thing for a kid to feel confidence in their abilities, to do something and to be competent. It's another thing when you are an integral part of the survivability of this branch of the cult, that that if you don't pull in money, then people won't eat and you won't be able to pay the bills or something. And that's a whole other level of a so-called self-esteem around the ability to adult as a child, right?
Yeah. Well, that is, one of the reasons that I do speak out, even though it took me a long time to talk. It's that many of us cannot speak out. We have a very, very large suicide rate. We believe it's 30 times more than even the U.S. military. Everybody is very secret about whether or not they've been in or not. So getting the numbers is very tough. But, there's our identity as kids was in our ability to work or bring in money or being sexually available. We're not allowed to have personalities. There was one personality, and it was to smile and be happy all the time. There's a lot that the survivors are going through, and very, very few of us can speak out. I know probably personally just 5 other people who are speaking out publicly, and
out of thousands of kids.
Yeah, it's and a lot of us are not here anymore. The suicide rate is extremely high, and just the drug abuse. It's there's a lot of issues. In some ways, I'm not a good representation of a cult survivor because I do feel like I've done well, and there's a little bit of survivor's guilt there. If you compare me to like quote unquote regular people, you're like, oh, she's not a doctor, but I'm doing quite well compared to a lot of other people. And I think it's important for those of us who can speak to speak out, because, while our story is pretty extreme, we're not really getting into any of the extremeness that was going on in the cult. I try not to get into details, but it was pretty intense. And this kind of stuff is real and it happens. And, until our society becomes educated and I want to say emotionally educated, emotional intelligence is huge. And, a lot of the reasons I think that our parents fell prey to this and people fall prey to cults is because of not being emotionally intelligent, not understanding how do we raise our children? What do kids need? What do the people around me need? What is purpose? How do people find the purpose in their life? I just listened to a really good podcast. I don't know if you listened to Dr. K.
I know of him.
Yeah, he just did a great one on finding your passion. And these are just subjects that our society has never really, in the past dealt with. But people need to have purpose in life. And I don't think it matters what the purpose is, but you need one. You need to feel happy and fulfilled, and forcing other people to do what our purpose is and forcing our children to have the same career as us and not really paying attention to the complexity of each person's individual needs, which you do a great job. Just watching the reality shows and looking at this person and that person and discussing like, oh, this person might have needed this, or in this situation, somebody needs that. Like, probably to you, it doesn't sound super complicated, but a lot of people have never even heard that concept, that we all have these different needs and they're not wrong. It's just, that's what your needs are. And I think kids are just as complicated as adults. Like, they have specific needs. And I wish I knew all of this when I was raising my kids, and I tried, but I guess my grandkids.
Yeah, then the generational trauma will be even more diluted by that point.
It sure will be. Yeah. Yeah, I do love that. Like, with me and my kids, we have a lot of honest conversations, some that are very difficult, but that's not common, I think, with a lot of families. And in our family, it's kind of like, yeah, let's talk about the difficult things.
Do they appreciate outwardly how much better you did as a parent?
Yes. Yeah. My kids are some of the most awesome, well-balanced humans I know.
But they tell you that, like, they appreciate that you overcame, and
yes.
they thank you for that?
Yeah, and they're happy that I'm speaking out. Okay. And they're I mean, I know this is cheesy, they're my best friends. But it's really neat that, like, I basically grew up with my kids. And so in some ways, I do have wisdom, and, I feel like I've lived 100 lifetimes. But at the same time, we're kind of equals in that, like, we kind of grew up together. And, they're very insightful. And they're all in therapy, which is great. They're really cool, loving people.
That's great. I would have assumed that at their age, they wouldn't be at that stage yet. And if they weren't, I would assume that they would eventually, because usually in our 30s, 40s, we start to really see the humanness in our parents, and are better able to, if it's, it's wise to do so, to forgive our parents for the, mistakes that they made, especially in light of when we learn what they went through as children themselves.
Yeah.
Are you and your family religious?
No, we're not. We're, in some ways, we're kind of spiritual. Like, we're definitely not, maybe we're agnostic. There's a lot about Christianity I love and that I'll never reject, but I probably could never do organized religion or listen to anybody using God or Jesus' name as, translating for a higher power. So, but I did, when I first got out of the cult, I brought my kids to church and to Sunday school, and it just seemed like a safe place to bring them. I was very scared of the outside world, and so it was, and that has its pros and cons too. We grew up in Louisiana in the South, so there was a lot of very harsh conservative attitudes in some of those churches, but I needed the community. I didn't know, it was a good place to kind of disappear into, and there were enough similarities to me in the cult structure to feel comfortable. I don't know how else to say that, but we do talk about God and spiritualism, and I believe there's something bigger than us. And I don't know, an energy, there's something that connects us. Maybe it's the collective unconscious. I don't know. But I'm open.
Yeah.
Nobody will ever speak for God to me again.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah, I could see things going either way for people of your generation in the cults. I could see them being in your camp. I could see them being very anti-religion. I could see someone being very conservative religious, but just not as conservative or as high control as the cult. You alluded to something earlier, and I was getting the vibe from you that you didn't want to go into details of what had happened. So, we don't have to talk about that, but for a lot of reasons. But I do want to emphasize to the listeners who might not have a sense of that, and of course, you don't. I'm not going to say anything explicit or brutal or graphic, but the way that you describe or talk about your cult experiences, you're kind of hitting on the topic sentences, and since I've talked with a lot of cult survivors, high control group survivors, I can fill in the gaps that other people. I feel like that part of the story, or at least the next sentence should be at least alluded to, that the amount of control, mind control, abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, flat out rape, and forcing people to hand over their bodies in a variety of ways, their minds. I'm going to take a guess and say that there was physical harm as well.
Extreme physical harm, yes. I was beaten till I was unconscious. We were sent to camps. We were publicly beaten, duct tape over our mouths. It was very bad. I do want to talk a little bit about the sexual stuff. I don't necessarily get into a lot of details just because I don't think it's necessary. It's kind of like the religion thing, like we're talking about Christianity. There's a misconception that once you've been through this kind of trauma, sexual trauma, that you are now ruined sexually, and that you can no longer have a healthy sexual relationship, and that basically there's only one path for you. And I'm a very sex positive person, and I think I believe in exposure therapy. I believe in a healthy ever after. I do think that your abuser does not have to control your future. That doesn't mean that there's not hurdles that I've had to overcome in taking control of my body. And, it might take a few years, it's not overnight. But as sexual survivors or survivors of sexual abuse, we are not ruined or dirty. And we can enjoy sex, and we can have a healthy sex life. And I love how sex positive your podcast is. And, sex positivity was something that the cult touted as something that they were the only people in the world that had, and that outsiders hated sex, and that it was bad and selfish, and only sex in the cult was good. However, sex in the cult was not fun. It was not personal. It wasn't, it was bland. And if I can say non-consensuals, you weren't allowed to have fun. You weren't allowed to be yourself. You weren't allowed to explore. So, when I came back to the States, I remember one of the first places I was living was in Santa Barbara on a beach, on the cliff. And I remember looking over the cliff and down, and it was a nude beach. And I had no idea that Americans did this kind of thing. And everybody's just walking back and forth nude on the beach. There were families. There were people sunbathing, and there was bunch of guys doing volleyball over here. And I remember thinking I thought everybody hated sex outside of the cult. It was just, and it was a lie that they used to keep the adults in, especially the men in the cult, saying we're giving you this freedom. And they would tell us children, this is a freedom that you are having and you should be happy about it. And I just think sexuality is not something that other people should ever control. And we as sexual trauma survivors are allowed to have a healthy sex life, and we're allowed to pursue it. There's so many resources out there, which you talk about. There's sexual therapists. There are now sexual coaches that are getting accredited So I know you talk about that. Make sure you're going to somebody who has studied, who has certification. But yeah, you can own your body and you can do what you want and you can enjoy it. It's not always easy, but you're not ruined.
Yeah, that's such a great message, and such a stigma. It's such a lie. It's such a lie, and such a system of control to further oppress survivors. How'd you get out?
Well, the father of my children, after the founder died, they kind of started trying to get new recruits again. And he was looking at joining the cult. And he had gone through the training to get in it. It's a very extensive training period. And was about to leave. He had just made it through the training and decided it was not for him.
What attracted him to it?
Well, we presented, wow, this is a rabbit hole. So we presented as, I told you we were well trained. So we presented as a humanitarian religious community that were Christian missionaries, and we looked great. Like, we smiled, we were happy. We had pictures of us going to old folks' homes, of helping the world, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I want to help people. This looks great."
So where is this? What one of the countries?
This was in Japan. He had an accident, and he was in the military, and he was not in a good place. And he met these beautiful, sparkly people. So even we can back up a little bit. Eventually, they called it flirty fishing, and it was, where you attracted people with sex, and you had sex, and you would get money, sometimes converts, but mostly money. When they stopped that, the sexual, I don't know what you would call it, flirtation continued. Like, we were all taught to be very attractive and look people in the eye and touch them as much as possible and be very winsome. And we were a very sparkly, beautiful cult. They have professional videos. If you go down the rabbit hole of looking into the Family International of the Children of God, it's shocking. Like, the facade
So he was an American GI?
Yes.
So he was one of the flirty fish on the hook.
Flirtation wise, by that time they had stopped actually having sex with outsiders, but there was a lot of, he had said a lot of females surrounded him and, spent time with him every night until he decided to join, just holding his hand. And, but yeah, so anyway, he was about to leave and he met me. It was very interesting. I guess we fell in love, and we asked to get married, because you couldn't get married without permission.
So what was that like to fall in love? I mean, isn't that a personal need?
You're not
experience?
supposed to fall in love. Like, you love everybody.
Were you in love, or do you even know if you were in love?
Well, we're divorced now. I think we were. I think just that I was very childlike and didn't understand. Like, I still struggle in my dating life now, is still the whole, I grew up without seeing normal relationships at all. I didn't see boyfriends and girlfriends. Husband and wives were forced to be swingers, to have orgies, to send their wives out to prostitute. And then they weren't allowed to be really romantic with each other or bring flowers home. Then they were separated. If they did seem to be into each other, then the cult would purposely separate them and marry them to somebody else. So romantic love just was not a concept that I saw or experienced.
Yeah. And how old were you at this point when you met him?
I was 19.
And so you feel feelings that is like a proto-love or a simple version.
I think I was in awe of him. So he seemed like the most educated person I had ever met of my age. He had, not only had he read books, but he actually went to high school. And I just was in complete awe and worship of him, which is not a good place to start a relationship. I know that now, but he was very, very smart. And I think the fact that he did not fall in love with the cult was also a good sign. But So anyway, we asked them for us to get married, and they said no. They said you can have sex, but you are not allowed to get married. So I got pregnant like the first time, and then we went to them and said we'd like to get married. She's pregnant, and they said no. We're actually going to separate you now, and we're sending you to 2 different places. And he was like, well, we're having a baby. And they said, oh, no, we're taking care of the baby. The baby's our baby.
Meaning that you wouldn't have the baby, or you would just have the baby?
They just said, we're going to take care of the baby.
Did they take babies away from both parents?
Not at that point, but they did. So what they did during, it was called the school vision. And they had like boarding schools. And so within communes and then also boarding schools. So within a commune, the parents didn't keep the children. The children would all the babies would be in one room. All of the 8 and 9-year-olds would be in another room, and they would all live together, eat together, everything together, that age group. And then the parents would have like separate rooms, and the parents didn't take care of the kids. Different people would take care of the children.
So the parents would have like visitation with the kids or something?
So they would have visitation. Usually it was like once a week.
Oh my God.
And every country was different. So
once a week? Is that what happened to you when you were a kid?
I was as a middle schooler and high schooler, was one of the people that took care of the children.
But did you have your parents around?
No, not after 11.
But pre-11, your parents were there?
Pre-11 I did, because I was one of the older ones.
Maybe that's what helped you to have resilience, because you had those attachments preserved during those critical years.
Probably not. I had a very, very, very bad situation.
Okay.
Yeah, my stepdad was his father was alcoholic and physically abusive, and so much so that in the 1950s, the state came and after his mother died, took all the children away from the dad and put them in an orphanage. And then he ran away from the orphanage and became a sex worker in Hollywood, and met the cult when he was like 17, after living on the streets and being a sex worker. And so he brought a lot of that trauma and violence into the cult, and the cult protected him until the world started taking notice. And then at that point they kicked him out. But, we were already adults by then. No.
It would have been a step up. It would have been a step up for you to be in the...
So for me, leaving my family, actually, when the cult took me away completely, was quite a relief.
Wow. So you are in this relationship with him, you're having a kid, and they're telling you both that you're not going to have access to each other or your kid. And then what happens?
So he does something that I had never seen in my life. He says no. And I was just completely shocked. I was like, what? I cannot believe he's saying this. And he, again, being in awe of him, I was like, oh, my leader. He said no. And he said, that's my child. I'm going to take care of my kid. And
was this sort of like transferring cult leadership from the cult to him or something?
Yes. Yes. And, and I do think there was love there, so I don't mean to, it's just, nothing is simple when you're in that kind of situation, so it wasn't a simple relationship. I think the fact that he was drawn to the cult and not in a good place and very young, and I had been in it my whole life, like, it's kind of hard to just say, oh, we fell in love and it was beautiful. Right. It was more complicated than that. So, but yeah, he did the right thing. And he said, no, I'm going to take care of my kid. And they didn't know what to do. The founder had just passed away. And so I think the group was in flux, and they were like, okay, they didn't know what to do. So they let us be together. They would not let us get married, though. They said, no, absolutely not. And then it took him 2 years to talk me into leaving. He kept saying, let's leave. He tried talking me to run away to Vegas and get married. I just kept saying no. I'm like, we cannot leave. And he would say, why? And I would say, because they won't let us back in if we leave. And he just could not understand. He could not comprehend what I was saying. And so he stayed. And then finally, he bought some tickets and we went to go visit his parents without permission. And I thought that they wouldn't let us back in, but they did because it was just a short visit. Usually once you leave, you're... and then the second time we went to visit, his parents had said, like, oh, you guys can, we have an extra room, you can stay. And I was like, oh, I just didn't trust that I could survive out in the world. I just could not see it. I was not happy in the cult. I did not like it. But, I just thought life was misery. And that was just par for the course. And that once I left, we had been told so many cautionary tales of suicide and prostitution and drug addiction. And unfortunately, they were correct.
Well, gee, I wonder why. I mean, it's no wonder why those things would happen afterwards.
Yeah. So I was very terrified. And for 10 years, people now, they're like, we thought you were like painfully shy. And I'm not shy at all. I'm the least shy person on earth. But I presented as extremely shy and I didn't say anything. I just watched and listened. The world was just a very scary place out here. You do have a community in a cult or a high control group, and there's pride in that group as long as you are part of the group. On your own, you're nothing. You're less than dirt. But together, there's this narcissism of we are powerful, we are special, we are the best people on earth. Everybody else is garbage. By yourself, that's what you are. And they would literally say that. You're just a piece of dust. You're nothing. But with the group, you're strong. And so to lose that, you're kind of lost and alone. And everything around you supports that because you don't know anything. You don't know how to ask or how to decide paper or plastic. You don't know where you want to go. You don't know what you want to eat. Everything has been decided for you. How many pieces of toilet paper you used was decided for you. Nothing was your choice.
How many were you supposed to use?
2.
Oh my God. So 2 squares, right? So in my family, there's this little side note because it relates. I didn't grow up in a cult, but in my family, it's this well-known joke that we still make fun of my dad about, which is that for some of us kids, the 4 of us kids, my dad, I guess, was in charge of teaching us how to use the toilet and how much toilet paper to use. And we remember, some of us, but I think my younger brother not, being told explicitly to only use 2 squares of toilet paper. And we all kind of remember, like, well, the door is closed, so I'm going to use 3 squares of toilet paper.
Right.
And I might even use 4 squares.
Oh,
and so
that's hilarious.
we make all these jokes about it. And now my dad's, he's not mean. And whenever we talk about this, my dad is just like kind of shaking his head like, I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. And I think what we determined was, he's teaching us when we're 2 years old, maybe 3 years old. And our bottoms are very small at that point.
Very tiny. Yeah.
And so 2 squares probably covers it. Right. And if you don't delineate some number, kids will just go fling, and just pull wads and wads.
To remember.
Yeah, because it's kind of fun to just wad up a giant, loofah of toilet paper blob. And so he was like, only use 2. And he was also probably thinking, well, they'll use more than 2, but if I say 2, they'll do 4.
Yeah.
But that's so funny. So that they told you that you could only use 2.
Yeah. Well, and unlike your dad, the door was not allowed to be closed. Usually somebody was in the bathroom with you. You weren't allowed to lock doors.
Wow. Whenever you went to the bathroom?
You had to be 2 by 2 all the time.
Wow. Like a peer or a counselor?
It could be a peer. It could be a peer or somebody younger than you.
And there's probably a lot of indoctrination into telling on other people.
There was a lot, yes. It was the cult of confession. So you told on yourself, you told on others, so. But I love that you told that story because isn't it interesting how people grow up with these crazy, vastly different lifestyles, yet there's things that we can relate to.
Yeah.
And, and it makes me happy to hear that, because, there's this feeling that I've always felt like not only am I a foreigner,
like you're an alien or something.
I lived on an alien planet. None of the rules apply, because no matter where you go in the world, if you're in South America or Asia or America, there's still some staples that you can all relate to. But it's so neat when you really start talking to people and you hear these little stories and you're like, okay, we can relate. There are relatable things. It seems like a stretch, but it's not.
Well, yeah, me too. I've never also heard someone with a similar two square story. Are there positive memories you have?
Yes, there are. And it's funny because I loved traveling. Probably because it was an escape. Because whenever they sent you to a new commune or a new country, you weren't going to see that uncle or that auntie again. You may never run into them again. So you were escaping bad situations all the time. But there was also something exhilarating that I found in going to different countries, seeing different cultures, even if it was, there were some places I went where I didn't leave the commune for a year and a half. But the ride from the airport to the walled commune was magic. And those moments were like, I think when you have so much pleasure in life, like things can get lost. But there were so few times where we had freedom and pleasure, that the times that we did, just for me, just stood out like, a bonfire. It just, a bonfire on an island where there were no other lights. It's just, I remember one fun memory I had in Japan. We got invited onto a Russian fishing ship. And I was 14 years old, and we went to go, preach the gospel to them and get some money. But the captain he had other ideas. He invited us on his ship, and he decided he was going to give us Russian chocolates and vodka. And so my first shot of vodka and the first piece of chocolate I remember eating was at 14. And I remember watching the adults' faces as they ate the chocolate, because sugar and chocolate was forbidden. But sometimes if you were out, to not be rude, you might have to partake. And I remember watching the auntie's face eat that chocolate after I ate mine, and just looking to see if she was experiencing any of the pleasure that I was having, and just wondering, like, why would they be willing to give this up? Like, it tasted so good. And I remember it melting in my mouth, like this melting sensation, and just thinking, like, it just felt like silk in my mouth. Oh, it was amazing. And I didn't like the vodka so much, but I love those memories. I'm still kind of like that to this day. I love to travel. So there were definitely good memories. Another good memory that, it's very hard for me to find things about the cult that were good. But I can say that, maybe it was to a pathological extent, but the community, just having people that you needed them and they needed you, and you were alone in the world except for them. You had this big community. Like I said, I think it was to a pathological extent, but I felt the loss of that when I left, and haven't found that since. So it's a powerful feeling, and I don't know if I can say that's good, but
I think it is. On one level, you could say you were all in the foxhole together as survivors of trauma and abuse. I'm guessing all or most of the people that you connected with, if they were given a chance to fully experience the outside life and a healthy support system outside of the cult, they would have, preferred that. So it's not like all those people, even the aunties and the uncles, were saying, yes, the cult is the best, even though I know what the outside world's like. So, and I think that that's something that is lost when we talk about cults, because often it's like, well, why would someone want to do that? And you talked about purpose earlier, which is obviously a big part of it. But another big part of it is community, is feeling like love bombing is one term we could have, but even just the insular automatic acceptance that you get from people, like when you would go to another commune, it'd be all new people. I'm guessing there was a feeling of just like, well, but we're all family here. And
it feels like unconditional love, because you're automatically part of this tribe that's so tight, and you didn't have to do anything or be anything to be there.
Right.
Now, in reality, there's a huge price to pay.
Right.
But what those groups do is in our group, they taught us, here's how you hug them. Here's what you say. Here's how you make each other feel welcome. And it continued throughout my entire life. When you would go to a new commune, everybody in the commune would come and hug you. And it felt legitimate. Like it felt you. I'm
sure some of it was. Obviously there's an asterisk of control and roboticism to it. But
it's the hive mentality.
Yeah, but eventually, maybe after a few weeks, you start to integrate, and the real human needs and behaviors start to manifest, and there's probably some real genuineness to that. Like with cults or groups like Scientology and other kinds of high control groups, Jehovah's Witness, Teal Swan, Nexium. The thing that I think often is lost, and I think when we watch documentaries, it's like, particularly if it's edited this way, it's made to look kind of ridiculing at the members, that look at these weird people doing these weird things, believing in these odd things. Like, why would they do that? They're sheeple. But we evolved from for hundreds of thousands of years from previous species and our own early species to grow up and live our entire lives with the same 50 to 100 people.
Yep. We're pack animals.
Yeah, and we had that unconditional love. There was no condition on who was in. You couldn't be. You could be kicked out, I suppose, but you were just a member just because you were a member. That's because you were born into it, and we feel comfortable in that. That makes sense to us, and that experience is so rare in our contemporary society, and we see a lot of problems from that. And I think that's why cults and other high control relationships are so enticing at first, and even the perpetrators might gravitate towards it for similar reasons, because we're all trying to return back to that. And one of the only ways you can really establish that in our pluralistic society is through a tremendous amount of artificial barriers between the in-group and the out-group. Yeah. And tremendous amount of control around, you cannot even approach opposing the in-group, because then we start to blur the lines between the in-group and the out-group, and then we will lose this cohesion and this feeling that we have. And so I think, so since you've left, have you had anything close to that kind of experience?
No. I guess my kids and I are very close. But no, I've not experienced anything like that. Even at church, I always would go and wish that they would have the touching that the cult had, just the grabbing you, bear hugging. And it'll, like some different churches I went to, you'd have some of that, but it just wasn't as intense. So I haven't really felt the intensity. And I think there's a bit of a high there, or an endorphin rush. I've interviewed a lot of, secretly, because they don't want to come out, first generation adults, and, kind of have been trying to dive into, their stories and why they joined, what kept them there, how I'm very interested in why a second generation left. why we all rejected the doctrine when it's all that we knew. Yet the first generation, most of them won't admit that it was wrong, will not come out publicly against it, and never really wanted to leave. So how is that? How is it that we young people, after the founder died, had a mass exodus, when we were raised in it? So I do think there's something about free will in there that we never truly gave our consent, but the adults did. But also, like, most of the adults talk about the community and how they felt instantly welcomed and loved. And they were already not sure about who they were as a person anyway. So giving up this identity kind of didn't really mean a lot to them. They already were kind of feeling isolated from society. So they didn't feel like they were giving up an identity to be part of this big beehive. They gained something. And, even some of the more complex issues like the flirty fishing with the prostitution, I've talked to some of the adult women, and, most of them were coerced into it. It wasn't consensual. And the ones that were, they were having so many babies and were never treated romantically. They were always working. So for them to be able to leave the commune and go to a bar and have some man treat them nice and kind and tell them they were beautiful, felt really good. And so they liked it. And when I was younger, I was extremely judgmental. I was just like, how could our mothers be prostitutes? And, I see it very differently now. But I love that you're saying that about the first generation. And like, we have to understand that they were vulnerable. And people look at our cult, especially the Children of God, as a pedophile cult. This was not a pedophile cult. It was a sex cult. The founder was a pedophile, and he did encourage pedophilia. However, most of the people were not, even the people that engaged in those activities were not enjoying them. They thought God was speaking through him. They thought the world was ending. It's really tragic. But not, I want there to be a path to redemption for the first generation. I would love for them. I only know 2 adults that are speaking out publicly. We just had a great documentary made with a bunch of my friends. I was on Investigation Discovery Cults. We just did a documentary, so you can go check that out.
What are these things called? What are these documentaries called?
So Investigation Discovery, it's Cults and Extreme Beliefs. You can look at that through, I think it's Discovery Plus is the channel. It's called Children of the Cult, and you have to pay for that series, but it is an amazing documentary. I think it's a 5-part docuseries, and they like fly you around the world, and you can see they follow these are my friends, people I lived with, but it follows them from country to country. They do manage to track down some of their abusers. You're able to really see the massiveness of this cult and the massiveness of the conspiracy. You have the police in the documentary discussing how difficult it is because none of us knew anybody's names. We were not allowed to use our legal names, and then they would change your names, and all the adults had different names. So, and then anytime that you were in trouble, they would change your names.
What were your names?
I was just Christina or Tina because I was a goody two-shoe and I didn't get in trouble.
I see.
But my brother had like 3 names, and to this day, I still call him different names every time I see him. My mom had a couple different names. My dad had different names. It was usually once you got into adulthood that they would start changing your names, but you were never allowed to know anybody's legal names. You were not allowed to know your address, where you lived. So prosecution is very difficult. If you get a chance to watch Children of the Cult, I'm in it in a little tiny clip. You can see me as a 12-year-old in one of the training camps, but it's a very well done documentary. So I recommend, if you're interested, go watch that. And if you want to do a deep dive into insanity, you can go to xfamily.org and actually read the horrific doctrines and literature that the founder put out. But it's, it's not for the faint of heart.
Yeah. Is Teal Swan a cult leader?
Absolutely. So, one of the things, as I watched her documentary, I was telling you about Robert Lifton, who is a psychologist, and he studied thought reform in China. And this was way back in the 1960s. And I love him. He's spot on. But some of the things that I noticed about her is she just kind of hit all of these typical cult leader checklists. And one of the most obvious is her reluctance to allow her inner circle to have romantic relationships. I'm just like, wow. I mean, like, you just have the playbook targeting suicidal or, people that are in bad situations. Some of her members changing their names, becoming a new person. Her non-negotiable list was so much of what we experienced. There were just all these non-negotiables. You are, like they would tell us, you are a slave. You are bought and paid for. You don't own yourself. Some of her theories of if you leave, how her one follower, he left and she's like, he's not my family anymore. I thought he was family. Once you leave, you're cut off. Just the isolation of having her inner circle live with her, it seems nice. She has a first follower. So first follower theory is very interesting. You can look this up, but every leader has a first follower, and if you think about it, like anybody who has been successful, especially as a cult member, a cult leader, you have a first follower. The first follower gives you legitimacy. You by yourself, no matter how charismatic, unless you get that first follower, you're not going to create a movement. But every movement, every leader of a movement has a first follower. And I love that even she had one.
With Blake.
Yeah.
I think of people like Bikram. I think of the guy in Oregon, Osho.
Mm-hmm.
Had his secondhand person, a woman. And I was thinking about that when I was watching the documentary with Teal Swan, was that Blake kind of fit that profile. Someone who was 110% a follower, and also submissive to her, worshiping her, but also kind of in a romantic, sexual thing with her in
almost
a sense.
Almost always, yes.
Yeah. And would, fight her fights for her at times.
Yeah.
And protect her from the outside world. And it almost is like you need that role in order to have a successful cult.
Yeah. Yeah. Ours was Karen Zerby. She was, she's now the leader of the group and still free, mind you. But she was the first follower of David Berg, and she was complicit in everything. She propped him up. She wrote down every word that he said, and she was the one who made it law. So he would say the crazy things, and then she would write it down and say, make this happen.
Yeah. And you think like Ghislaine Maxwell, this kind of thing.
Yes, exactly like her. Yeah. There's a lot of similarities in that as well. The retreats and stuff that she is having people go on. It's funny because they did that in our cult. They had retreats for, especially for us youngsters. When we became, like I said, 11, 12, they started sending us off to these camps that were like retreats. And those would work for a time. But then, like all cults, it has to escalate. And then they had like prison reindoctrination camps that were pretty awful. Those were no joke. But I was watching the docuseries, and I kept feeling like, wow, she really has all the narcissistic characteristics of a cult leader, but it's only really hurting this one. It is hurting more people because it's pseudoscience that she's, pseudotherapy, but, she's directly hurting this small group. And I was just thinking, I wonder how many cults are halted because there's more information out there, because there is internet. It gives me a little bit of hope that, and I said this earlier, there's a little bit of hope that maybe we can't stop it from happening completely. Obviously, it's still going on, but maybe we can keep it from being thousands of children around the world enslaved, for financial gain and for sexual gain, like happened to us.
Are there other groups that you are concerned about currently? Even like political groups or that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm always concerned about Scientology because they have so much power and money, and have managed to stay so secretive. But I also feel like there's hope because we're getting the information out there. The Mormons seem to be trying to become legitimate, which I think that's interesting. I've always been interested in when we talk about Trump as a cult leader. This is probably going to be very controversial of me to say, but I think extremism on either side makes me feel the cultish vibes. Even if it's the side I'm leaning more towards. I lean a little more probably progressive. But even when you get too extreme and you're like, everybody who voted for Trump is evil and bad, I'm like, oh, that feels, because I grew up communist, hating America, hating capitalism. We called America the whore. It was never just America. It was never the US. It was America the whore. I hear us talk about Trump and I do see, okay, he has a cult-like following. He has narcissistic traits. I keep having trouble saying that, but you know what I mean? He's got those traits. But having lived in a real cult where you have no freedom and you have no way of getting out, where the physical punishments are so severe, it's uncomfortable for me to say Trump is a cult. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But I do think it's good for us to look at different leaders that come up and say, wow, is this person cultish? Do they have cult-like qualities? Are people following them with such fervor that it's kind of disconcerted? I mean, I think there's a lot of, it can be a movie star. It could be anybody. It could be you. People could start worshiping you. You're never going to let that happen. But, I think that just like with narcissism, there's traits that certain people have. It doesn't make them a cult leader, but I think it's good that we as a society are like looking at that and kind of going, what's going on here? So I sort of just look at them all the same. Like, I don't trust any of them. You have power. I don't trust you.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you're the canary in the coal mine on some of these things because you're so able to see that coming a mile away. You're probably able to be like, oh, that sounds, even though I agree with you politically, you're starting to sound like I feel like we need phases of cults or degrees of cults, right? Yes. Like your cult was like a 10 and maybe the political cults are like a 3 or something.
Yes. Yeah. I think there are people who have rated cults, or I'm using the wrong word.
Degrees of cult.
Yeah. And I think ours is in the top 10. We're not number 1 only because we didn't do mass suicide. Like
Jim Jones.
We are like pretty much the worst cult ever.
Yeah.
And I say the cult I grew up in.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you could be cult light.
Yeah. And you point out on both ends of the spectrum, which I would agree with you that, and I guess the hallmark that you identified is no allowance of nuance or freedom of speech or thought. And if you indicate anything other than the party line, you are not only ostracized, but you're consequenced in this extreme manner. And that's one of the elements of a cult.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's evident if you watch the docuseries of the Teal Swan, you can see a great example of that. Just any questioning is you're 100%. If you're not for me, you're against me.
Yeah.
Which was a phrase we used in, the children of God. If you're not for us, you're against us. But healthy discussion it's a positive thing. Disagreement, it's good. Your debate is good.
Yeah.
And I've had a long journey. When I first got out of the cult, I didn't think being gay was okay. I was like, what is that about? That's weird. If you took what I thought then, when I was much less educated than I am now, I would be one of those people that you hate.
You were so much more, but even compared to where you came from, you were practically super progressive because you were pulling yourself out of the cult. Yeah.
But, everybody, there's a journey for everybody. So maybe somebody is racist. That doesn't mean that they have to be racist for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
Are they willing to listen? Are they willing to learn? Are they willing to grow? If they are, then there's hope for them.
So how did you make that transition away from heterosexism?
My little brother actually came out. He's quite a bit younger than me, and he was, I think, 14 at the time. He came out, and I was like, well, he's not a bad person. I love him. And I was like, maybe I need to look at this.
Did you start to think, well, I know my cult taught me this was wrong, but maybe American society has an element of this cult?
Well, and I was still going to church at that time, and everybody in the church, these were Southern Baptist churches, and they were all very much against being gay. So the people that I was surrounding myself with at that time were also anti-gay. So, but it was that again, it's another good example of why if you are a cult leader, you want to control people's personal relationships, because that is powerful. So my love for my little brother made me question one of my beliefs and the beliefs of all the people around me, because I loved him. And I was like, oh, I love him. He's not a bad person. Maybe it's okay if he's his own person and does his own thing. And that was, so.
It's interesting to think about how the similarities, when you start seeing the extreme, which is rare, but happens, unfortunately, sometimes. And then we scale it back to, say, a contemporary mainstream Christianity, and how they also, as you were saying, controlling sexuality. And I think another element of this is that sex is such a big deal to us, just fundamentally, but also in our society, that if the church or the high control group has a lot of rhetoric and control around it, it's almost like you're in and outside of the person's body at all times, because you're giving them such a complex that they have to turn to you for methods of control and confession. It's like all day long, because it's a human impulse that everyone has. And so it's this straight shot into control of the whole human being, and a way to punish people, and a way to, sanction people, and a way to direct their motivations. It's like, well, if you want to have sex, here is the route, but you have to go through my system.
Yes, in order to have it.
Yeah, and the sex negativity at the very least, but also specifically the anti-gay stance is a watered down but potent version of that high control method. Yeah, exactly. Pretty sick when you think about it, really. It is.
But it is interesting, isn't it, how so many people just seem to naturally use this as a control form, because it isn't just cults. It's governments, it's friends, it's romantic partners. It's very interesting to look at that and be like, okay, you're not safe from somebody trying to control you. It seems to be more common than we would like to think.
It's like we're all indoctrinated into at least a level 2 cults when we're born into our society.
Yeah, but if you look at history, you have to go pretty far back. But there were societies that were free sexually and where there was less misogyny. And it's kind of it's more the post-Christianity world that really promoted the control of sexuality. There were a lot of cultures where it was honored, where it was seen as, very godlike to be connected to your sexuality. And it does seem to be a more modern, based on the history of the world, it is a more modern phase that we've gone through where we look at sexuality in such a negative light.
Yeah, it's like we've gone backwards over the past thousands of years or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not a super historian around this, but I have read a number of reports and analyses of when Columbus and his, criminals, including him, landed in the West Indies, in the Caribbean. The reports of the people living there from the Europeans was idyllic, that they weren't ashamed of their bodies, they weren't ashamed of sexuality, they shared everything, they were happy all the time.
Yeah.
There was no war, there was no crime. I mean, I'm sure there might have been some minor issues or something, but the freedom, away from systems of control, the way that they lived was more human. And when you think about how that society, who knows really, but that society could have been so advanced, but we look at it as they're a bunch of savages who don't have technology or guns, and they're not wearing clothes, but they could be the pinnacle of society that we managed to wipe out with our slavery and guns and our germs.
Yeah, Guns, Germs, and Steel. That was a great book.
Yeah. I walked myself into that book title.
But no, you're right. I was listening to, I think he was a sociologist, and he was saying the same thing, that hunter-gatherer tribes tended to be much more peaceful. They did not need to engage in marriage or monogamy in the same way. It just was more like natural. You just naturally wanted to take care of your kids. They did not have as much war. It was when we became farming cultures that we started having wars and having territorial disputes over land, because before that, it's just not the same type of thing. So those were more, and he was talking about that we could actually get back to some of that.
I had Christopher Ryan on the podcast a few years ago, who wrote Sex at Dawn, and
yes,
and also the book he was promoting at the time was called Civilized to Death, which has to do with all this stuff. And I remember him opening my eyes regarding that. So I don't know, he comes to mind in terms of a proponent of these ideas, this misnomer that somehow civilization and technology is a step forward, when in a lot of ways it could be a step backward. And what he's doing, and maybe by now he's accomplished it, was in Colorado, he was starting a commune. Yeah, scary.
Oh no!
Yeah, but at least on the surface, what he was saying was he was pulling together community members who would live in individual homes in this development, that each would contribute in different ways.
Yeah, actually, that sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, one person would be the carpenter, another person would be the architect, another person would be the contractor, another person could be the dog walker. Like everyone brings something to the table, and freedom of thought, and also trying to live simply, not trying to consume and buy and all this kind of stuff. And so maybe he's already accomplished that. So Christina, thanks for coming on the podcast. You are amazing in a whole number of ways, as a survivor, as someone who overcame the trauma, someone who's raised wonderful kids that only need the minimum 5 years of therapy to recover, like I said. You talk about it in a way that destigmatizes in the most rapid sense. Like as you're talking, like I can't get out of the indoctrination of the stigma. And you said, I don't know, 7 or 8 powerful things. I was like, yeah, I know that intellectually, but when you say it, Christina, when you talk about it, when you bring it forth in this very natural, but, meaningful, powerful way.
It's lived experience, isn't it?
But it's also just your ability to talk about it, the freeness that you say things, and the ease is the word I want to say. You have a very easy way of describing things.
Well, that's one of the reasons I'm speaking out. I feel like I do have a natural talent to speak. I have faced my trauma, still am. And I'm not going to lie, at some point I got tired of keeping the secrets, and the freedom to be able to just, I used to have to lie so much when people are like, oh, did you watch Wishbone? What about this band? And I would lie. I would be like, oh yeah, that was great. And they'd be like, oh, remember when we used to do, oh yeah, I do. Yeah. And then I would make up stories about where I came from, where I grew up. And I don't have to anymore. Now, I don't actually tell people, oh, guess what? I'm a sex cult survivor. Usually I get to know them more. But even though I've been on national TV, I've been on Dr. Oz, the Megyn Kelly show, and all this stuff, nobody ever recognizes me, which is lovely. I don't tell people right away, but I don't have to keep those secrets anymore. And there is a liberation in that. My whole life was about keeping secrets and lying about it. And now I'm just like, I am what I am.
Yeah, I mean, you're a role model, not only just for cult survivors, which I know there are some listening, but I think more universally, all of us have been through difficulty. All of us have shame.
Yes.
All of us have been indoctrinated into, a system of control in some respect, like we were talking about earlier. And just the role model, the way you talk about it, the way you look at things, you're not like, I don't know how to say it. It's just a very easy, you make it, I'm guessing for people listening, they're just like, well, yeah, when she puts it that way, maybe I can see this through, and maybe there is a path forward. I think that's amazing that you have this voice and you're talking about it.
Yeah. Well, I think it's amazing. I'm still one of the ones here that I agree. It is amazing, and I'm thankful, and I have a lot to be thankful for. Gratitude is not the same as denying hardship and denying bad things. You can also be grateful as well. Like, we can have both.
Well, everyone out there, please take care of yourself. Christina, why should they take care of themselves?
Because you deserve it. You really, really do.